The victory that saved Europe was also the one most carefully rewritten. In the aftermath of 1945, Soviet propaganda transformed collective sacrifice into a single, state-controlled legend. Records show how Stalin's regime censored inconvenient allies, inflated its triumphs, and buried the scale of its own losses. What the world remembers as liberation was also manipulation. Let's uncover the 10 myths that history never told in full. 1. The myth of a unified Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Union's official narrative of the Great Patriotic War presented a nation united in purpose, sacrifice, and unwavering loyalty to the state from the first day of Germany's invasion in June 1941. For generations, this story framed the war as a singular, harmonious effort by all Soviet peoples, bound together under Stalin's leadership in a just and defensive struggle. This narrative became central to Soviet identity and was institutionalized through education, cinema, and commemorations. Yet archival evidence and post-war analyses reveal a far more fractured and complex reality. The early months of the war were marked not by unity, but by confusion, mass surrenders, and internal division. Between June and December 1941, more than 3 million Soviet soldiers were captured, many due to the disarray following Stalin's purges of the Red Army's officer corps in 1937–38. Entire divisions dissolved under encirclement, and widespread desertions reflected the lack of cohesion between the state and the people. In regions such as Ukraine, the Baltic states, and parts of Belarus, segments of the population initially welcomed the German advance, viewing it as liberation from the terror of collectivization, famine, and NKVD repression. The Soviet leadership's decision to label the conflict the Great Patriotic War was a deliberate act of rebranding. It detached the Eastern Front from the broader Second World War, positioning the USSR not as a belligerent in a global conflict, but as a victim defending its sacred soil. This rhetorical shift allowed Moscow to erase the politically inconvenient context of its 1939–41 cooperation with Nazi Germany and to recast the war as one of moral purity. Behind the slogans of Brotherhood of Nations, however, lay a system of coercion. Mobilization often depended on fear of punishment rather than patriotic zeal. Blocking detachments, units tasked with preventing retreat, were deployed by the thousands to enforce discipline through executions and arrests. Ethnic minorities were targeted with suspicion, accused of potential collaboration, and many were deported en masse from frontline areas. Soviet propaganda films and literature later concealed this coercive machinery, instead portraying the population as willingly united in sacrifice. In truth, unity was manufactured after victory, not during battle. Understanding this myth reveals that the Soviet state's wartime cohesion was achieved through control, censorship, and repression, not spontaneous patriotism. It reframes the Soviet victory not as a testament to harmony, but as proof of a regime's ability to weaponize suffering into narrative power. 2. The myth of the USSR's sole victory over Nazi Germany. For decades, Soviet history taught that it was the Red Army alone that defeated Hitler, liberated Europe, and bore the entire burden of the war. This claim formed the core of Soviet wartime and post-war identity, establishing moral authority over Eastern Europe and ideological superiority during the Cold War. Yet the notion that the Soviet Union single-handedly crushed Nazi Germany disregards the essential contributions of the Allied powers. By 1941, Germany's invasion had inflicted catastrophic losses on the USSR. Soviet industry, though formidable, was heavily dependent on external aid. Between 1941 and 1945, under the Lend-Lease program, the United States and United Kingdom supplied the USSR with hundreds of thousands of trucks, tanks, aircraft, and locomotives, as well as food and raw materials essential for sustaining production. Without these shipments, the Red Army's mobility and logistical capacity would have been gravely diminished. The Western Allies also opened critical fronts that divided German forces. The North African Campaign, the invasion of Italy, and the D-Day landings in June 1944 forced Germany to fight on multiple fronts, relieving pressure on the Eastern Front. Strategic bombing campaigns destroyed German industrial capacity and transportation networks, indirectly supporting Soviet advances. Despite this, Soviet propaganda systematically erased these contributions from public consciousness. State-controlled media portrayed Allied operations as secondary or belated, implying that the USSR had already guaranteed victory by the time the West intervened. This distortion served Stalin's political goals. By claiming exclusive credit for defeating Hitler, the USSR justified its post-war occupation of Eastern Europe as the rightful reward of the principal victor. The truth is that the Allied victory in Europe was a product of interdependent efforts, military, industrial, and logistical, among all major powers. The Red Army's achievements were immense, but they did not occur in isolation. The insistence on sole victory obscured not only the sacrifices of others, but also the shared cost of defeating totalitarianism. To understand this myth is to recognize that history's narrative of triumph was deliberately narrowed to serve one state's political purpose, transforming a coalition's victory into a solitary legend. 3. The myth of the USSR as a lifelong enemy of fascism. In Soviet memory, the USSR was portrayed as the unwavering foe of fascism from its inception, an ideological opposite to Hitler's Germany and the first victim of aggression in 1941. This version of events framed the Soviet state as morally pure, its entry into the war forced by treachery rather than shaped by prior decisions. However, the historical record demonstrates that the Soviet Union's relationship with Nazi Germany was not one of consistent hostility. The signing of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact on 23 August 1939 exposed the pragmatism behind Soviet diplomacy. This non-aggression treaty not only ensured mutual non-interference, but also included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Following this agreement, the Soviet Union invaded eastern Poland on 17 September 1939, coordinating with German forces advancing from the west. In 1940, the USSR annexed the Baltic states and occupied Bessarabia, actions enabled by the terms of the pact. Economic cooperation followed. Soviet shipments of oil, grain, and raw materials flowed to Germany until June 1941, directly supporting the Nazi war machine in its campaigns against Western Europe. When Germany invaded the USSR, the Soviet state rapidly reframed its narrative, transforming from partner to betrayed victim overnight. Post-war propaganda omitted these years of collaboration, and Soviet textbooks described 1939-41 as a period of neutrality rather than partnership. The myth of consistent anti-fascism thus served two purposes. It obscured Stalin's diplomatic opportunism and bolstered the USSR's image as the moral counterweight to fascist aggression. It also justified post-war control of Eastern Europe by portraying the Soviet Union as the natural guardian against fascist resurgence. Reassessing this myth exposes the fluidity of wartime morality and how political necessity, not ideological conviction, guided early Soviet policy. The pre-war collaboration, once buried, reveals that the Soviet stance against fascism began not in 1939, but only after its own survival was at stake. 4. The myth of the Red Army as the liberator of Eastern Europe. The post-war Soviet narrative held that the Red Army brought freedom to Europe's oppressed peoples, delivering them from Nazi tyranny and restoring sovereignty to their nations. Soviet monuments across Warsaw, Budapest, Prague, and Riga stand as stone witnesses to this message of liberation. Yet what followed in 1944-45 was not liberation, but the imposition of a new political order under Moscow's control. As the Red Army advanced westward, it established pro-Soviet administrations, disarmed local resistance movements not aligned with communist ideology, and enforced obedience through occupation. In Poland, the legitimate government in exile was ignored, and the Warsaw Uprising of 1944 was left unsupported, allowing German forces to crush it. In the Baltic states, Soviet forces reoccupied territories first annexed in 1940, deporting thousands to Siberia and suppressing nationalist movements. In Hungary and Romania, Soviet troops remained long after the war's end, overseeing the installation of communist regimes. Soviet propaganda portrayed these actions as people's revolutions, but the orchestration from Moscow was unmistakable. Political opposition was neutralized, and the NKVD established extensive security networks to control information and suppress dissent. Cultural propaganda reinforced this image of benevolent liberation, depicting Soviet soldiers as selfless heroes bringing progress and peace. The lived experience of occupied nations tells a different story: mass arrests, requisitions, and the silencing of independent voices. By 1948, nearly every country liberated by Soviet forces had been transformed into a satellite state, tied to Moscow politically, economically, and militarily. The myth of liberation thus became a justification for empire. It allowed the Soviet Union to reframe dominance as deliverance and occupation as friendship. Revisiting this myth forces a reassessment of what victory meant for those on the receiving end of Soviet power. It reveals that the war's end in Europe was, for millions, not the dawn of freedom, but the beginning of a new kind of control. 5. The myth of the 28 Panfilov Guardsmen. Among the most famous legends of Soviet heroism is the tale of the 28 Guardsmen of Panfilov's division, said to have destroyed 18 German tanks while defending Moscow in November 1941. The story appeared in Soviet newspapers within weeks, describing how 28 soldiers fought to the last man, shouting patriotic oaths as they fell. It became an emblem of Soviet courage, recited in schools, celebrated in films, and memorialized in monuments. However, investigations conducted after the war revealed the episode was largely fabricated. Military reports from the period make no mention of the event, and several of the supposed martyrs were later found alive, some having been taken prisoner by the Germans. The myth originated from a war correspondence article written under censorship pressures to provide morale-boosting content during the desperate defense of Moscow. The Soviet Information Bureau quickly adopted the account, turning it into a national legend. When internal reviews decades later confirmed the story's fictional nature, state authorities suppressed the findings to preserve the myth's symbolic power. This narrative served a deeper purpose than mere propaganda. It provided a human face to the abstract notion of Soviet sacrifice. In a war of staggering losses, over 20 million dead, the tale of the 28 Guardsmen offered a manageable story of valor, obedience, and unity. Its endurance through decades of state promotion demonstrates how wartime myth-making became institutionalized as national memory. Even after the Soviet collapse, official resistance to discrediting the legend persisted, showing the power of narrative over fact. The myth of the 28 Guardsmen captures the essence of Stalinist propaganda: the deliberate creation of moral exemplars to personify a nation's suffering and to sanctify its leaders' policies. Understanding this myth reveals that the Soviet victory story was not merely about defeating an enemy on the battlefield, but about controlling how that victory would be remembered for generations to come. 6. The myth of Stalin as the master strategist of victory. The Soviet narrative of World War II elevated Joseph Stalin to the status of supreme military genius, the architect who foresaw, directed, and ultimately secured victory against Hitler. This belief was cemented in post-war Soviet culture, where Stalin was portrayed as the indispensable commander, guiding the Red Army through every crisis with precision and foresight. School textbooks, wartime films, and official speeches referred to him as the Generalissimo, the strategic mind behind every Soviet success. Yet the archival record tells a markedly different story, one in which Stalin's leadership was often reactive, inconsistent, and deeply compromised by his own mistrust of the military command. Before the war, Stalin's purges of the Red Army between 1937 and 1939 executed or imprisoned tens of thousands of officers, including most of the senior command structure. This purge crippled the Soviet military's readiness, leaving the USSR vulnerable when Germany invaded in June 1941. In the first 6 months of the war, catastrophic losses mounted, with millions captured and vast territories lost. Stalin's refusal to believe multiple intelligence warnings of a German attack, including reports from his own agents in Berlin and Tokyo, allowed Operation Barbarossa to achieve total surprise. His early wartime orders, particularly the prohibition against retreat in encirclement battles such as at Kiev in September 1941, led to the capture of more than 600,000 Soviet troops. Only after these devastating losses did Stalin begin delegating operational control to experienced commanders like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vasilevsky. Archival communications from the Soviet General Staff indicate that many of the Red Army's turning points, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, were shaped less by Stalin's directives than by the initiative of field commanders acting under constrained autonomy. Even so, post-war propaganda recast every success as Stalin's personal triumph. When the war ended, Stalin took full credit in public addresses and state publications, minimizing the contributions of his generals, many of whom were quietly demoted or sidelined. The myth of the genius commander thus served a political purpose. It transformed the chaos of early defeats into evidence of calculated endurance, reinforcing the infallibility of the regime. Understanding this myth reveals how the Soviet victory narrative depended not only on rewriting events, but on reassigning authorship, turning a collective struggle into the achievement of one man whose mistakes had nearly cost the war itself. 7. The myth of the unbroken heroic home front. Soviet propaganda during and after the war presented the civilian population as unflinchingly loyal, enduring starvation and hardship with patriotic resolve. This vision of the home front as an unbroken pillar of sacrifice became integral to Soviet national identity. The narrative depicted farmers working through bombardment, factory workers producing weapons around the clock, and families willingly giving all for the cause of victory. Official posters and newsreels reinforced the image of unity and devotion. However, the reality on the ground, preserved in local archives and NKVD reports, contradicts this idealized picture. The war's first 2 years plunged the USSR into unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. Tens of millions of civilians were displaced, and the hasty evacuation of industries to the east caused widespread shortages and famine-like conditions. In occupied territories, collaboration and resistance coexisted in complex patterns. Many civilians sought survival over ideology, and some communities initially cooperated with German authorities in hopes of escaping Stalinist control. Within unoccupied Soviet regions, discontent was evident. Reports from 1942 record work stoppages, theft, and desertion from labor battalions. The state's response was coercive. Special tribunals prosecuted thousands for defeatism or sabotage, and strict rationing enforced compliance through fear. While it is true that Soviet industry achieved remarkable output, moving 1,500 major factories eastward by 1942, this success came at immense human cost, often under forced labor and with severe mortality in Gulag-linked production sectors. The portrayal of the home front as uniformly devoted ignored these realities. Propaganda erased the internal conflicts, black markets, and survival tactics that defined wartime life. By presenting endurance as voluntary and collective, the state turned necessity into virtue. After 1945, this myth justified continued hardship under the argument that Soviet citizens were capable of unlimited sacrifice for national strength. To uncover this truth is to see the Soviet home front not as a harmonious machine of patriotism, but as a society surviving through compulsion, fear, and adaptation under an authoritarian system that could not afford the truth of its own fragility. 8. The myth of the moral superiority of Soviet warfare. In official Soviet accounts, the Red Army fought as a disciplined, humane, and morally upright force, the defender of civilization against fascist barbarism. The myth of moral purity distinguished Soviet soldiers from both their Nazi adversaries and their Western allies, whose strategic bombing campaigns and post-war policies were often portrayed as ruthless. Soviet propaganda emphasized the Red Army's strict codes of conduct, its respect for civilians, and its restraint during occupation. Yet the historical record demonstrates that the Soviet war effort, like all large-scale conflict, was marked by severe atrocities, reprisals, and systemic abuses. As the Red Army entered, Eastern Europe and Germany in 1944–45, mass violence accompanied its advance. Reports from Soviet archives and Western investigations document widespread looting, destruction, and sexual violence against civilians. Orders from the Soviet High Command to maintain discipline were often ignored, overwhelmed by the chaos of total war and years of accumulated resentment. Soviet propaganda responded by censoring reports of misconduct and framing all retribution as just punishment for fascist crimes. The state-controlled press never acknowledged that many of the victims were not Nazis, but ordinary civilians in regions already freed from German control. The myth of moral superiority also obscured Soviet actions earlier in the war. Executions of political prisoners during retreats, forced deportations of ethnic groups accused of collaboration, and summary punishments within liberated territories. The Katyn massacre of Polish officers, denied for decades and blamed on Germany until the late 20th century, became the most infamous example of this suppression. By maintaining an image of moral purity, the Soviet Union preserved its ideological claim to post-war leadership in Eastern Europe. The myth was not only about wartime conduct, but about legitimacy. If the Red Army had fought honorably, then Soviet rule could be portrayed as the natural continuation of liberation. The truth undermines this foundation. Like every belligerent, the Soviet state committed grave violations, and its deliberate concealment of these crimes reveals how propaganda turned moral ambiguity into a weapon of control. This recognition challenges the very core of the wartime narrative, that righteousness, not survival, defined the Soviet struggle. 9. The myth of complete Soviet industrial self-reliance. Another enduring Soviet claim held that the USSR's wartime production miracle was achieved entirely through its own industrial might and socialist organization. Propaganda films celebrated the rapid relocation of factories beyond the Urals as a triumph of socialist planning, presenting Soviet industry as unmatched in its capacity and independence. The myth reinforced the image of a self-sufficient system capable of surviving isolation and defeating an industrially superior enemy. In reality, the Soviet economy during the war depended heavily on external assistance and extraordinary improvisation. The Lend-Lease program, initiated by the United States in 1941, supplied the Soviet Union with over 400,000 trucks, 13,000 locomotives, 14,000 aircraft, 8,000 anti-aircraft guns, and millions of tons of food, fuel, and raw materials. These materials sustained the Red Army's logistics, mechanization, and mobility from Stalingrad to Berlin. Soviet factories focused on armaments, but even this depended on imported machine tools and metals. Archival reports reveal that more than 90% of Soviet high-octane aviation fuel came from Allied supplies. American canned food, particularly Spam, became a staple of Red Army rations. British and Canadian shipments of tanks, jeeps, and aircraft filled crucial gaps during 1942–43, when Soviet losses had reached catastrophic levels. Despite this, official Soviet accounts minimized or ignored these contributions entirely. Lend-Lease was barely mentioned in wartime newspapers, and post-war publications attributed every industrial success to Soviet ingenuity alone. This omission served both ideological and geopolitical purposes. Acknowledging dependence on capitalist powers contradicted the narrative of socialist superiority and independence. Moreover, as Cold War tensions grew, the USSR could not publicly admit that its survival had relied on the material aid of its future adversaries. The myth of self-reliance thus became a cornerstone of post-war pride and propaganda. Understanding the truth behind it highlights the paradox of Soviet victory, a triumph sustained by the very economic systems it claimed to oppose. Far from diminishing the Red Army's achievements, this reality deepens appreciation for the interdependence that defined the Allied war effort and exposes how ideological narratives overwrite the practical collaborations that made victory possible. 10. The myth of the eternal, unquestioned Soviet victory narrative. After 1945, the Soviet Union enshrined the victory over Nazi Germany as the moral foundation of its existence. the myth of the Great Victory became untouchable, woven into every aspect of public life. Victory Day was not only a commemoration of triumph, but an instrument of unity and obedience. Official history silenced the complexities of the war, the early failures, the mass casualties, the moral compromises, replacing them with an idealized vision of heroic inevitability. This narrative was maintained through education, censorship, and ritual. School children learned of a war fought flawlessly, of a people entirely loyal, and of leaders infallible in their wisdom. Dissenting voices, including veterans who spoke of the chaos, the hunger, and the repression that followed, were suppressed. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet state used the memory of victory as a shield against criticism, equating patriotism with acceptance of the official story. Even in the post-Stalin era, challenges to the war narrative remained politically dangerous. Archival access was limited, and films or books that depicted moral ambiguity were censored or banned. The result was the transformation of history into a civic religion, one in which questioning the past was treated as betrayal. In this myth, victory was eternal, untainted, and indivisible. Yet the long-hidden archives, opened in fragments after the fall of the USSR, reveal the cost of maintaining that illusion. Behind the polished parades and solemn speeches lay the unspoken grief of millions of families, the devastation of entire regions, and the silencing of those whose experiences did not fit the state's script. By turning memory into propaganda, the Soviet Union ensured that even truth itself served the interests of power. The enduring legacy of this myth is that history became not a record of the past, but a tool of governance. To confront it is not to deny victory, but to restore its human dimensions, to see the war not as legend, but as the immense, complex tragedy that it truly was. History rarely tells everything, but what it leaves behind still defines how nations remember themselves. The Soviet myth of victory was not only about power, it was about controlling memory, shaping what could be said and what must be forgotten. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and keep questioning the history we were taught to trust.